The plaster is now ready to pour out onto the spot board. First we're going to wet down our spot board to prevent it drawing any moisture out of the plaster, which can cause it to go off too quickly. While the surface is still wet, pour out some of the plaster onto the spot board, keeping the rest of the plaster in the bucket where it will keep in the best condition. The trowel and hawk should also be wetted down, ready for the plaster. It also helps to remove any dust. Next, we take a small amount of plaster and smear it around our hawk to prime it, and to help the plaster sit better on the hawk when we load it. To load the hawk, slide some of the plaster off the spot board onto the hawk. We then begin to work the plaster by transferring it from the trowel to the hawk a few times. This helps reduce any bubbles in the plaster, which will make laying it on the walls easier and also improves the consistency. It's also good practice for handling the plaster. Try to keep the plaster heaped on the middle of the hawk. You can be sure that some of the plaster will hit the floor, so ensure that you have your floors well covered. Remove any lumps as you see them, as they can create pulls in the surface when you are plastering. Everything is now in place to start plastering straight onto the now tacky PVA covered plasterboard. To recap, wet down the spot board and tools. Pour out all of the plaster onto the spot board. Charge the hawk and trowel with plaster. And work the plaster a few times to reduce bubbles. PVA has many uses in the building trade. It is a general purpose glue that is used by plasterers for two main purposes. PVA is used to control surface suction as a primer coat. It is also used to help the plaster bond with the surface it is being applied to. Without PVA, there is a serious risk that your plaster will dry out too quickly and unevenly, making it unworkable. There is also a risk that your plaster will not adhere to the wall properly and fall away in chunks, blown plaster as it is known in the trade. Every plasterer has his own unique opinion on what PVA mix to use and at what stage. A good rule of thumb is to use a 5:1 water PVA mix to prime a surface to control the suction. A 3:1 mix is the classic bond strength to use before applying plaster. The rule is, the more porous, dry, dusty, flaky or uneven the surface, the greater strength of PVA mix you should use. Consult the handbook for specific advice on different surfaces. The aim is to first seal the surface with a weaker primer coat to reduce the rate at which it sucks water out of the plaster. This should be allowed to dry and can be done in advance. Then, apply another coat at a stronger mix to help the plaster bond to the wood, typically 3 parts water and 1 part PVA. The plaster is then applied while the PVA is tacky, not wet, or before it dries out. New plasterboard does not need to be primed with PVA. As a bonding, simply apply a coating of 3:1 PVA water mix and apply the plaster while the PVA is still tacky. If in doubt, use a 50-50 mix of PVA and water. Never apply PVA to seal new plaster before decorating. This is a common myth and will prevent your paint or paper sticking properly. You should prime new plaster after 3 days with a 50-50 mix of cheap emulsion and water before decorating.